Good afternoon, everybody. It is freezing cold where I am right now in Curitiba. There was even a rumor that it was going to snow. I don't know, I'll believe it when I see it, but my son is hoping to make a snowman sometime this week. This class today is focused on discussing and concluding. And a lot of people, some people had written messages last week wondering what should they do with the results in the discussion and conclusion section? Should they write results and discussion, and then separate out a conclusion, or just write results, then a separate discussion section, then a separate conclusion section? We're going to get to all of that today. Today we're going to finally talk about that. Before I forget, though, I want to say that next week we have a special class where we're going to bring somebody in from the communications department at the university and talk about what happens after you conclude your research article, and talk about your research to try to publicize your research to the larger society. We're gonna do that and have a practical activity related to that as well. All right, so today, as I said, we're discussing and concluding, and talk about, should you merge the results in the discussion section or separate them out? We're also going to talk about limitations and why they're important, and the concept of a rhetorical move called hypothetical reel and why that is important, a useful tool for argumentation. Also, we're going to talk about a concept called hedging. We're going to revisit the idea of claims and warranting, and that was from a long time ago that we talked about that. And again, should you separate out the conclusion section? So we have a lot to cover today, so we'll get right to it. All right, so should you have a results or a results and discussion section, or should you separate them out? And the answer to that is actually a pretty easy one. The most important thing is that your readers of your article should be able to distinguish what you found from what you think. Okay, so it doesn't matter what science you're writing in. It doesn't matter if you're writing in the humanities, if you're writing in basic or applied sciences, it doesn't matter. Whatever your science is, if you have results and you're going to discuss those results, you can put the results and discussion together in one section, but your readers need to be able to discern, to distinguish between what you found and what you think. Okay, so that's the simple answer, but of course in practice it may not be that simple to make that if you haven't done it before. The answer to whether you should do it or not is kind of something that you should think about on an individual basis, that you should discuss with your orientadores and your advisors on an individual basis. And whether or not you merge discussion and results or separate them out has a lot to do with the nature of your results, and if it's more convenient to the reader to be able to interpret what you're saying through your discussion with the results, or whether your results represent a kind of important part but encapsulated part that really needs a discussion that is separate from that. So it kind of depends on the nature of your results. There is no answer to whether it is a good or bad idea for all studies to merge results and discussion. Again, that's something you should talk about with whoever your research partners are. But the important thing is, in terms of writing, this quote is taken from the book Writing Science, is the ability to distinguish what you found from what you think. Okay, so let's look at some examples of this. First of all, you can say that in terms of the results, when you present results, however you present them, whether they be separate or in a discussion, you're going to present the results in a few different ways. You can kind of divide them into these three kind of categories. One would be just the data, the figures, the numbers, the findings, whatever they are, just the data. So if you're talking about something like that meat consumption and odor study, then you might have something numerical where you're showing that there was a difference, some kind of appreciable and quantifiable difference between pleasantness of odor. If you're talking about findings in terms of results of an interview, for example, the data themselves would just simply be what people said, the quotations themselves. Then you have what are called your inferences, and that's especially what you mean when you're talking about inferential statistics. So not just the data, but what they mean in terms of if you run a calculation, if you run the data through different formula, different tests to infer meaning in terms of statistically significant meaning of, for example, a t-test or an ANOVA or a MANOVA or a regression or whatever. Those would be inferences drawn on the data. And then finally, interpretation, which is basically you adding your own words to what they mean. So saying this test shows that this number is significantly greater than the other number, something like that. Right? So you have three different types of just pure results presentation. So here you have an example of what I'm talking about. This is from the results section of the MEET study, and here you have basically the data that drives these bars here, and then you have inferential statistics here with a p-value and ANOVA, and the author adding information here that the differences are significant. So that's the interpretation of the inferential statistics. So running an ANOVA, for example, would be inference, and then explaining why they did that. All right, now, whether or not you merge your discussion with those data, so whether you present your data and use inferential statistics, or you interpret the inferential statistics, or just present the quotations, or whatever it is, categories from content analysis, whatever it is, if you discuss your data, there are 6 common elements that one typically finds that we discussed last week. So it doesn't matter if you merge them, or rather, was it last week? Yeah, last week. It doesn't matter if you merge the sections or not. Those elements should be there. So just to recap, those are the 6 ones. If you can recall that the first one was revisiting points raised in the discussion, comparing your results and how those results converse with other studies and their results, expanding or explaining or extrapolating on what the results mean, talking about the applications and the implications, talking about limitations, we'll be talking about that today, why that's important, and then how the study advances the area. And as you'll see, this also can be recapitulated in a conclusion section, but for now, let's just stick with the discussion. Okay. Why are limitations important? And I find that especially for some reason, talking to people in Brazil, that they're afraid to put in anything about limitations in this study, because they're afraid that, first of all, limitations mean that they're talking about weaknesses. That's not necessarily the case. And also that if they talk about limitations, they're going to be detrimenting somehow their chances of being published. And what I want to emphasize today is that actually talking about limitations in your study can serve to strengthen your research, or at least strengthen the chance that the reviewer will see your research positively. And I'll show you what I mean. So first of all, limitations are not defects. If you have defective research, that means that you have something wrong in your method section, your methodology, for example. Then it doesn't matter if you write wonderfully or you have a perfectly edited and structured manuscript. If you have defective research, then of course, then you're not going to get published, or you shouldn't get published anywhere. So I'm not talking about like serious defects, but what the point is that there is no such thing as a study that doesn't have some limitations. In this case, what does limitations mean? What am I referring to? What I mean by limitations is that how generalizable are the findings in your study? What are the limits, the limitations, but what are the limits of the interpretability of your findings? Because remember, your results will always be an artifact of the method that you use to yield those results. And therefore, how much I can interpret or how I interpret those results will also be as a function of the method used. So whoever your participants were, whatever instruments you were, there's always something that delimits the extent to which I can draw inferences or extrapolate or generalize the claims of what your results mean. And this guy, the good old naysayer, you could say that that's the reviewer of your manuscript, for example, or the editor of the journal. They are going to be looking for, and they will notice the limits, the limitations of how much you can assert the strength of your results are. And if you don't, if you aren't forthcoming and not honest about that, that naysayer can get a little bit irritated and frustrated, and will actually kind of proactively point out some problems that may exist. So a good writer is mindful of that naysayer when writing the discussion section and thinking about her or his results. And this thinking of this guy here also means that it affects your writing. It affects the assertiveness, the confidence that you express in your results and how you discuss the results. So let's take an example of this article from the Annals of Internal Medicine. And this is an article about relationship of coffee consumption with mortality. I'll have a drink of coffee while I think about that. And in this journal, as is in the case with a lot of journals these days, they actually require, and this is what's called a structured abstract, where they have these preset categories that they want the authors to submit: background, objective, and design. They actually have a requirement that the author be forthcoming already in the abstract of what the limitations are. In this case, the limitation is coffee consumption was estimated from self-report, thus some measurement error is inevitable, because if you do self-reporting, then of course there's all kinds of variables that can come into play that have nothing to do with what they're trying to find. So this limitation means that I can interpret the results of the study with that in mind, knowing, okay, yeah, they're self-reports, but let's look for the meaningfulness of all this within keeping that in mind, even though there is this limitation. And every study, as I said, has limitations. There was a study that was published in PLOS One some years back called All That Glitters Isn't Gold, a survey of acknowledgement of limitations in biomedical studies. And in this study, focusing on biomedical studies, they emphasize the importance of this. And of course, when you're talking about in the health sciences and the biomedical sciences, potential treatments and things that have to do with people's health, clearly you have to be honest about whether or not how strongly you can claim that your research is valid or useful or does what you say it's supposed to do. And in this journal and in this study, they actually talk, in the abstract, you have another structured abstract, and they actually have limitations. Even in a study about limitations, you have, in the abstract, a section of limitations. And they talk about how it was subjective to some extent, and the weighting scheme used by the hedging detection software has subjective elements. And we're going to talk about this word here, hedges, today, and how hedging is so important when discussing and concluding. And this is really a major part of science writing, and we'll talk about that today. But let's stick with limitations for now, and revisit an article that we saw earlier in the course. This was a highly controversial article because it touched off all kinds of debate, even in political circles. This is the Gauthier et al. Article in the Journal of Antimicrobial Agents, published in that journal in July 2020, but actually I think it was back in March, had already released in a preprint the results of their study. This is the hydrochloroquine and azithromycin as a treatment study. And as is the case, especially for preprints, a lot of people pick these up and critique them, these ones that are highly prominent, being talked about. And this one by Elizabeth Bick really kind of touches a note that I think is useful for our talk here today. She writes about this article in a blog post, which I've already posted on Moodle, called The Thoughts on the Gauthier et al. Paper about hydrochloroquine and azithromycin treatment of COVID-19 infections. And she points out some very interesting things. She points out that, for example, there are a number of confounds, a lot of confounding factors that could affect the so-called results. So she says, in an ideal clinical trial study, the control group and the treatment group should be as similar as possible. Most of you watching this know this. Patients should be of similar age and gender ratio, be equally sick at the start of treatment. That this pandemic is very hard to control that, and analyzed in the same way. The only difference between the two groups should be whether the patients receive treatment or not. This is clearly a valid criticism or critique of the article. That doesn't mean the article should be rejected, but if I were writing that article and I wanted to sell it as something that's really important, I would be mindful of this element about that there was no control group, that the treatment group was not symmetrical or as symmetrical as could be with the treatment group, rather the control group and the treatment group were not, and there was not randomized, there was no placebo and all that. But what I would say is I would be very transparent with that, but I would emphasize that in the context of a global pandemic, it was felt that with several caveats that it was worth putting this out there for people to read. So she points out that here the control and treatment group differ in various other ways from each other. Scientists call these confounding factors other than the treatment that are different from the controls that could explain. So what other things besides the treatment could explain? And in this case, there are a number of things. Okay. She also talks about how they were not randomized, as is usual in a trial like this. But of course, we're talking about a global pandemic. Maybe they were just trying to do anything, trying to grab at straws to find anything that would work. Some patients were chosen to be treated, while other patients were chosen to serve as controls. That might bring along all kinds of biases in which, e.g., researchers might be tempted to favor sicker patients. So there was a suspicion of a possible researcher bias. That bias would have to be, would ideally be included in a discussion section to say, okay, yeah, there could be some bias, admittedly, but, and there's that but in there. So there are limitations that are pointed out by Elizabeth Bick in this critique, which is also on Moodle, by the way. And so you would expect that these critiques would find their way into the article that was published on the Journal for Antimicrobial Agents, especially since she was critiquing what should have been a preprint version. so that the authors, that's why you put a preprint out there, is to oftentimes to receive feedback on it so that you can make a better article that is ultimately submitted to a journal. Especially in medRxiv, or where this appeared. But that was not what happened here. Instead, in the discussion section of the published version of that article, here, look at the tone that the authors set. They say here in the discussion, they say, for ethical reasons, and because our results are so significant and evident, we decided to share our findings with the medical community, given the urgent need for an effective drug against SARS-CoV-2 in the current pandemic context. That's true. And that is the context in which this was presented, and it does, to a large extent, would justify the need to put anything out there, except that in that statement, in that caveat that they put there, they put this are so significant and evident without qualifying that statement. They don't say anything like, although there are some possible confounding factors that could influence the interpretation or should be taken into account upon interpreting our results, we decided to share this anyway. No, they subtly, but I would argue kind of clearly convey a kind of confidence that kind of betrays the sort of spirit of limitations, especially those limitations as pointed out by people like Elizabeth Biggs. And then they kind of talk about all of the wonderful things that they claim that hydrochloroquine did with their patients. And then when they do talk about limitations, they talk about it like this. They say the cause for a failure of hydrochloroquine treatment should be investigated by testing the isolated SARS-CoV-2 strains of the non-respondents and analyzing their genome, and by analyzing the host factors that may be associated with the metabolism of hydrochloroquine. The existence of hydrochloroquine failure in 2 patients, mother and son, is more suggestive of the last mechanism of resistance, meaning that it's something to do with the genetics of the patients. So instead of kind of talking about the panorama of possible confounds that existed, and there were many, as pointed out by Elizabeth Biggs, instead, they tried to kind of chalk it up to, this mother and son genetic thing, and which kind of immediately, if I'm reading this, I'm thinking they're just trying to talk up the strength of their results and how hydrochloroquine with azithromycin is this wonderful treatment, instead of talking without hedging a little bit and saying, well, this looks promising, but there are all these other factors. And if they had done that, it would have strengthened their discussion. Instead, it looks a bit biased. The other thing that Elizabeth Biggs points out, and this is also problematic and not necessarily related to science writing per se, is that this article was received March 16th and accepted on March 17th, and then available online on March 20th. That is one crazy fast publishing schedule. Even considering the pandemic, even considering the urgency of the situation, it does not make a whole lot of sense that a journal would receive a manuscript to be published in their journal the day before they publish it. That makes no sense at all. In a preprint, okay. Even then, it's a bit fast. But here, that seems just really crazy. And so this sets off another kind of alarm bell that Elizabeth Biggs points out. And she says, well, that one of the authors on this paper, J.M. Rollin, is also the editor-in-chief of the journal in which the paper was accepted, i.e. the International Journal of Microbial Agents. This might be perceived as a huge conflict of interest, definitely, in particular in combination with the peer review process of less than 24 hours. This would be equivalent of allowing a student to grade their own paper. Lo and behold, the student got an A+. So all of this together, you could say, well, why was a paper with this week of a discussion allowed to be published. Well, part of the explanation might be because of the context of the pandemic, but maybe this other explanation here is also important, that there was some kind of inside track because the editor-in-chief was also an author on the paper, which you know, I don't know, that can be problematic. And so that taken together with the fact that the discussion was so weak, really kind of around the science community, I noticed, and mind you, I'm not a medical scientist myself, but just kind of reading what they wrote, all of these aspects taken together, the weakness of the discussion of the results, the overconfidence in the meaning of what the results meant, and these other things about the being published so fast in the journal kind of weakened the article in the end. So let's get away from COVID, because you probably had enough of that, and get back to this article here, this kind of gross article about eating meat and how you smell. And just to remind you of how grotesque that is, in the abstract, if you recall, they already kind of begin to mention some important variables that they will measure. So they say auxiliary body odor is individually specific and potentially a rich source of information about its producer. Odor individuality partly results from genetic individuality, but the influence of ecological factors such as eating habits are another main source of odor variability. However, we know very little about particular dietary components, how particular dietary components shape our body odor. Okay, so that there, of course, is your move number 2. And because it's a novel, apparently a novel study that looked into meat and body odor, one would want to make an assertion how exciting that is and want to have their results mean something exciting. But they're already very cautious about this, and they go on and they when they explain that they tested for the effect, they also talk about the design. They say that we use the balance within subject experimental design, 17 male odor donors raw meat, and then non-meat, so they talk about how there was counterbalanced, and then they talk about how fresh odor samples were assessed for pleasantness and intensity by women not using hormonal contraceptives. So this is all in there to talk about those possible confounding factors. And those are already mentioned in there, that the odor samples were fresh, that they were collected within 24 hours, that the hormones did not affect the smell or perception of the smell, and then they did a time 2 where they repeated the same procedure. They performed repeated measures ANOVA, and so and then the last sentence is really important, where they say this suggests that red meat consumption has a negative impact on perceived body odor hedonicity, and this word here, suggests, is key. That word suggests is just strong enough to say that you're not saying that this conclusively proves that it is the case, but that there is a suggestion of that. And that is a very small, apparently minor, but important part of not piquing the ire of the naysayer. So together you have in this abstract, a good presentation of what justifies the research, why it's novel, what the contribution is, and a hint of what important confounding variables were controlled for. And then finally, in what would be the discussion section, because you remember that good abstracts also kind of have an IMRAD structure to them. When they talk about what the results mean, they use a keyword there. Okay. And it breaks it down for you right there. Method, the results. So you have the introduction with the move 2 and the move 3, okay, move 1, 2, and 3 in the introduction. Then you have the method there, and the results, and the discussion. And the discussion with that very key word, suggests. All right, so already there, if I'm reading this as a reviewer of the journal, I'm already feeling that the articles were, the authors were being careful, and that it's a well-structured article probably. And then in the introduction, they mention that not only is body odor pre-programmed by genetic factors, but also variability is also due to psychophysiological and ecological influences. So it's already foreshadowing that there is going to be some discussion of mood, perhaps, and that is included there as one of the variables. They say, for instance, it has been shown repeatedly that body odor changes across women's menstrual cycle, peaking in attractiveness around time of ovulation. So that's going to be a variable they will control in the method section, as we discussed. Other studies have found that mood, for example, fear of a target person may influence hedonic perception of his or her axillary odor. So you have mood there. Another variable that is discussed already in the introduction section that will have relevance in the method section, which will then affect the results. Eating habits also may have a crucial impact on body odor composition. However, very little is known about the effect of individual elementary components on human body odor. So that's your move 2. Some folk beliefs, and we've talked about the rest of this already. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that already in the introduction, you have variables that are being included that could possibly influence the interpretation of the results. Therefore, they will be included in the method section, as we discussed. Then they will be talked about in what the results mean. And therefore, when you talk about what the results mean, you have to take these things into account and remind the reader that you looked at them. All of these things will feature again in the discussion. So in the method section, as I just mentioned, you have the inclusion of menstrual cycle as something that they controlled, and they also they emphasize the reason why, which is, remember, something that we talked about with method section, that you say you did this and why you did it. So they said they controlled menstrual cycle to minimize the possible effect of menstrual cycle on olfactory sensitivity. And the naysayers then happy. All right, now, in the discussion section, where they talk about, they recap what they did before. So they say the results of this study show for the first time that red meat consumption may have a perceivable impact on body odor. They mentioned then that this pattern was not influenced by raters' menstrual cycle phase or partnership status. This here is not necessary in terms of they wouldn't have to, they're not obliged to put this sentence in the discussion. There's nothing that makes them do that. But why do they do that? They do that because it strengthens what the results mean. Because if they had not done that, then the interpretation of the results could be, you could say, oh, well, wait a minute, I've heard that menstrual cycle phase can influence smell, and even married or unmarried can influence perception of smell. But they remind the reader, hey, we control for this in the method section, therefore you can take that variable out as influencing the results because we controlled for it. And then here, they move to talk about a limitation. So this is not a limitation, they're just reminding. And here they talk about a limitation. And let me show you how they do that. Let's look at how they do that. They say the number of odor donors was relatively small, 17 men. So that, is a typical, very common limitation that people immediately go to when they're writing an article. They say, okay, one of the limitations is we could have had 1 billion people, we only had 5. Okay, so they can put that in there. But then look at the structure they use. They say what the limitation is, and then they say, however, the nature of the experiment was balanced and within subject. So they say, yeah, the naysayer, they're thinking the naysayer could say, well, it's only 17 people. But it's strong. The statistics are robust because it is within subject and it was balanced. You're comparing apples with apples. And then the second one here, the second sentence, the in other words, adds to that. So they don't just stop there. They actually kind of add their own interpretation of the point that they make that, okay, yeah, there were small, but it was balanced, and therefore the statistics do mean something. So they say, in other words, each rater assessed some donors first in the meat condition and some donors in the non-meat. And then they add more. And they say, moreover, the diet we prescribed to our odor donors was identical except the meat content, right? So they start with this move here, this limitation move, and then this move, saying what the limitation is called making a concession. They are conceding this point. They're being honest about it. They're saying, yeah, we know it was small. But in that making that concession, they also say what they did to kind of counter this possible limitation to strengthen the meaningfulness of their results, which is that it was within subject. And then just as one does in the presentation of results, they add an interpretation of why this is important, this within subject part. So they say, yeah, in other words, just to remind you, this is what we did. We assessed donors in the meat condition and some in non-meat, and also they were within subject, and the diet we prescribed was identical. So even though it was small, the results are meaningful. But all of this was put in a limitation move, where they make a concession, and then they add their commentary on why it's still worth looking at anyway. But that therefore actually, for many reviewers, I believe, this would actually strengthen their research. It adds strength to what the results mean. Where many authors stop is here. They just will say, okay, and this is a problem, is when they just say, okay, this is what we found. The results of the study show for the first time that red meat consumption may have a perceivable impact on auxiliary body odor. Odors of donors in the non-meat diet were judged as more pleasant, more attractive, and less intense. That is simply a recapitulation of the results. And if these authors had just stopped here, they would sound too confident. Kind of in the same way, the French hydrochloroquine study sounded a little bit too confident in that very first paragraph. But they don't stop here, these authors, they continue. They add this last sentence to show, hey, we controlled for these variables, so that's why these results mean something. So they're writing with awareness of the naysayer when they're discussing. And they keep thinking about him as they write. Because the naysayer, they think, okay, well, the naysayer could talk about the sample size. So then they add what I just talked about earlier about, however, the nature of the experiment was balanced. That's making a concession. But there's more that you can do in the discussion section. So what if the naysayer thought, and I think they were anticipating this, the authors, but the mood can also influence the smell. Yeah, well, we talked about that. And so what did they do? The authors say, theoretically, our diet may have influenced the mood of the donors, which may in turn have an impact on the quality of body odor. However, this is probably not the case, as we did not find differences in self-rated stress, fatigue, and mood between meet and non-meet conditions. So this is the author saying, I see you, Mr. Naysayer. I know what you're thinking, but hey, this is what we did to prevent that from being an interpretation of our results. This move of saying this is what hypothetically could be the case, this could be a hypothetical interpretation of our results, but this is why we don't think that can be interpreted that way. That's called a hypothetical real move. This is a very useful move to make in your discussion of your results, because you kind of acknowledge what people could think. But this is why, because you were so good and because you were so careful in the design of your method, this is why your results don't mean that hypothetical interpretation. Again, this would be the case whether or not you are discussing your results as a separate section or in a results and discussion merge. But the naysayer could think, if I'm writing, their authors are thinking, but is it the meat per se or is it the protein? Well, they include that and say, well, potentially, hypothetical, potentially our findings may be a result of different energetic protein values. In other words, our diet only differed in meat content and therefore in energetic value. Thus, this factor could be responsible for the effect, but not the meat per se. However, so you have this hypothetical and then the real. However, if this would be the case, one may expect diet of high energetic value, i.e. meat diet, to be more attractive, as we found in the Bank-Vol study. But the naysayer might say, changes are probably quantitative, not qualitative, okay, because they presented the results that way, right? But, they say, one may argue, hypothetical, and who is the one? One is this guy. One may argue that the higher attractiveness of donors on the non-meat diet is due to quantitative rather than qualitative changes in their auxiliary odor. In our view, however, and look at this, our view, meat consumption changes, this is a they say, another way to look at this, they say and I say, or they say, we say. In our view, however, meat consumption changes the composition of some auxiliary chemicals, and therefore we believe that both changes of quantitative and qualitative nature are responsible for the observed effect. So what do I suggest? You should try practice being this guy. You should try practice being a naysayer. And I've mentioned this before. The manuscript submission process involves gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are the people who are reviewing the manuscript for the journals. The reviewers, the journal editors themselves, they're the ones preventing who can say yes or no to an article being published. But if you get in their skin, if you get in their shoes and read manuscripts the way they read manuscripts, that'll help you become this guy who is aware of the naysayer when they write, because you will also have been a naysayer. So talk to your orientadores, talk to your advisors and say, hey, next time you receive a request to review a manuscript, I am totally happy to also look at it with you or look at it separately and then discuss it, because once you do that, you look at a live submission to help decide whether or not it will be published, you will change your view about things. If you look at only published articles, well, that's kind of not really the same dynamic because they've already passed through that gatekeeping process. But if you become a gatekeeper or be a part of that gatekeeping process, you can develop that critical eye. And there's not really a downside to this, because you won't be the only reviewer. Most normal journals will ask for at least one other peer review. So even if you feel like, oh, I'm not really experienced enough to review, well, the other reviewer will also have a point of view. Usually, though, in my experience, when you get involved in this process as a doctoral student with your advisor, it's a win-win for the author, because the doctoral advisors, the professors, professor researchers often don't have a whole lot of time to go into a great deal of detail in their responses to authors. But not that grad students have a whole bunch of time either, but they have a bit more usually, and they're more focused in that way of and more excited about being part of the process to write in greater detail, provide more elaborate feedback to the author. The author wins. It's a win for the author because they get more elaborate feedback. The person reviewing wins because they get to practice to be a naysayer, and the journal gets quality review because somebody in that position who isn't asked to review manuscripts every day may be more excited to spend time and read it more carefully. So it's a suggestion I would like to make before I move on. All right, but moving on. I put this image up here of the lemons and the lemonade because when you talk about limitations, you can look at it this way as well, that you can also make lemons out of lemonade, that even though there are some limitations to everybody's research, that in reality, there actually can be some silver lining, sorry to mix the metaphors here, to those clouds. So when you talk about all of these elements, they actually, I talk about them separately, but really they can all kind of be interconnected, and just as your IMRAD should be connected, even these elements can be connected. So, for example, look at this from one of the articles that you looked at, the meat article. They point out a limitation. They say, well, at this point, it is not possible. It is not possible to say how long the meat content in food remains perceptible in auxiliary odor. This is not a bad thing. It just means that they don't know. Through their research, it's not possible. It was not part of their design to say if the smell changes over time, or perceptible, or how long. And they also say, nor do we know how long one must consume meat to produce discernible changes. So if you have to have meat every day, then it is a change. They don't know that. It's not part of their design. It wasn't their research question. Moreover, we can also only speculate about the already perceptible amount of meat consumed. So that is actually a limitation of the research. The 2 weeks diet period we chose for our study was based on results of an analytical study, which found compounds of environmental origin in axillary odor after 10 days of hygienic and diet restrictions. So all of that points about what the study does not do. So those are limitations. But then they say future studies should address the question of diet duration or quantity of meat consumption and changes of body odor. Further, it should be tested whether the observed effect is restricted to red meat or maybe applied to white meat. So what they're doing here is they're saying, yeah, these are limitations. We couldn't answer this in our studies, but look, this actually points to things that could be answered by other researchers in the future. So in the one paragraph, in the same move that they talk about limitations, they also talk about how it forwards the research. In that study that I mentioned earlier, this +1 study of limitations in studies, they also go into a very important aspect of talking about limitations that I want to emphasize in this class today. They mention, as I talked about earlier, this idea of hedges. They say they look at, in the article, they looked at phrases that express uncertainty, so-called hedges. And a lot of people feel like, uncertainty doesn't have a place in science, that science is all about being able to prove something, but actually, as I've talked about before in this class, it's not really what writing or contributing to science is about. It's about you entering a conversation. And as much as we want to feel like you are the one who is right and that you have all the answers, as you know, there's a whole lot of uncertainty in almost any science that I can think of. And because every method has a limitation, therefore there is you have to be able to express that uncertainty, or else it sounds like you're being biased. In this abstract here, this word suggests does not weaken your study at all. In fact, it's better. It makes it stronger. What I find is that a lot of Brazilians will write what I find when I read Brazilian manuscripts, they'll write that this study proves something. Esse estudo comprova something. And that's the opposite of hedging. That is really simply an invitation for the naysayer to say, well, I'm not sure that your results can really prove that. I think that they are suggestive of that. So hedging really is this, or I should say, this is not hedging. You don't see this in scientific articles, this title. The coronavirus is never going away. No matter what happens now, the virus will continue to circulate around the world. Well, that's just terrible news. And you can provoke like that in a news headline, but in a scientific article, that would sound just too absolute. So that's an example of not hedging. Let me show you some examples of actual hedging. So again, on the theme of the coronavirus, sorry, you're probably tired of hearing about the coronavirus, but coronavirus deaths at 20-year high, but peak may be over. Here, the hedge is May. Here, another article, dip in new COVID-19 cases likely due to significant delay in testing results. Here, the hedge is likely. Of course, you could simply say deaths at 20-year high, but peak is over. But that would sound too confident. You're talking about a situation here in which one does not know if it is over or not. In fact, this was the 21st of April, and we know that, at least in the context of the UK, I think that was from BBC, that peak definitely was not over there. So it was good that they used the word may. And the word likely here, they could say dip in new COVID-19 cases is due to significant delay, but there's too much uncertainty. There's too much uncertainty in the data to be able to make that assertion. So they very appropriately use the word likely. Another example, health experts warn COVID-19 could have lasting effects on the body. Here, the hedge is here. The word could. Of course, they could say will have lasting effects, but we don't have enough data. There are a lot of data that point to that possibility among certain patients, but we don't know. So they appropriately use the word could. Coronavirus test suggests 1.4 million in Italy have antibodies. Well, again, the antibody tests are not strong enough. They haven't been validated enough, especially at the point where this came out, to be able, not a large enough sample perhaps, to be able to make that affirmation with absolute 100% confidence. So that claim is hedged with the word suggest. Can you get COVID-19 through your eyes? Possibly. Should we all be wearing goggles? Probably not. Now, this came in the context of some reports saying that there was a famous medical journalist who claimed that he got COVID-19 through his eyes on a flight, but even he wasn't sure about that. So they asked this question, can you get COVID through your eyes? They can't say yes because they weren't sure yet, so it's definitely a possibility. Then they asked the question, should we all be wearing goggles? Probably not. It would be totally irresponsible for them to say no, because that would mean them implicitly encouraging people to don't worry about it, but maybe it is something to be worried about. So they very appropriately hedge, using these two hedges here, possibly and probably. So hedging is this. Hedging is, in academic writing, hedging is a hedge is a word or phrase used by the author or authors to show they are being careful about their claims. That's it. And in the discussion, it's something that is ubiquitous. It is something that is a fundamental part of being careful about the interpretation of your claims, your results, how you are interpreting your own results. As careful as you were in constructing the method, that's how careful you should be in discussing the results. So getting back to this study, and their perhaps overconfidence when they discuss their research results, here you can see that they do make a claim at the end about a possible genetic association with the non-responding patients to the treatment. But they do use the word suggestive. To their credit, they say that the failure in 2 patients that didn't respond to the hydrochloric treatment, that failure is more suggestive, but not for sure, not certain, that it was a genetic association. So a lot of people look at these words like these hedges and say, well, doesn't that weaken? Actually, it adds strength. So if you look at a corpus, like I've shown you in this class about how to put a corpus together of related articles. In this case, it's 191 research articles in the discipline of food science, just from native speaking authors, okay? And if you look for the word prove, it's actually a rarity. You have a total of 71 hits in that corpus out of, I think it's like 2 million words or something. But 2 million. Here, millions of words. But if you look at, here you have a Boolean character here any permutation of prove. And what you see here is actually the hits that you do get of those 71 are not about proving results, but things like the word proverb comes up, and provention, this thing that comes up in the one article here, this one here is the same article. And then the use of prove meaning has shown to be, so has proven difficult, proves difficult, and this is from different articles. So in actuality, if you counted it down, it would be something like 30 total hits. And if you compare that to a comparable corpus, in other words, from the same journals from non-native speaking authors, what you find is that the word prove is significantly more common, where you have 98 hits, but those hits qualitatively are also a lot higher. So what you see is that things like these results prove the importance. Our results prove this, and that is just a word again that doesn't send a good message to the naysayer. Here you have I guess it's the discussion section of that the meat study and odor. And just to remind you that they say that, well, current knowledge only allows us to speculate on what particular compounds and metabolic processes are responsible for hedonic changes in body odor after meat consumption. Then they say, we propose that it could be due to changes in amount or relative abundance of aliphatic acid. So what are they doing here? They're trying to interpret what the results mean. There are many ways that they could interpret the results, and that's good. You should explore interpretations. But in that exploration, they are appropriately careful, and so they hedge. They are clear that they are speculating about what compounds may be responsible for the changes in how the people perceive the smell based on meat. So they're clear about that. Then they say, we propose, and then they say, it could be due to changes. And that combination of interpreting results, but being clear that you are hedging your interpretations, is a way to actually doesn't weaken your argumentation, it actually strengthens it. So if you recall back at the beginning of our course, when we talked about the title, abstract, and the introduction, we talked about how these things, the title, the abstract, and the introduction, are really important to kind of guide the reader into what your point is, where you're going with the article. Those are really key things, but they are also very much connected. And one of the things that we talked about was how a lot of people can think about how their title actually is a way of they're already making a claim. So in this case, if you remember this article about the Mexican scientists and the burden of writing in English, they immediately talk about this claim that there is a burden. That's their claim, that there is a burden when they write in English. And then after this colon here, they say this is how we know, because they collected data from Mexican scientists. That's the evidence. And back then, at the early part of our course, I talked about how this structure, this claiming and evidence, or what's also called claiming and warranting, is a very strong way to build an argument. In fact, it happens throughout. It should happen throughout your article, that you're making claims and you're warranting those claims. You're providing evidence for them. And I talked about that in the context of the title, the abstract, and the introduction. Now I want to pick up that again, that move of claiming and evidence, claiming and warranting, in the context of the discussion and the conclusion. So many of you know this place here, the Madero, best burger in the world. And that's a pretty big claim. That's a huge claim. And it invites you to say, well, I need to know what the evidence of that is. And, that's a pretty easy claim to make, but a pretty big claim. And there is no evidence that they provide, at least in this ad. And this is, again, part of the building the argument. If you remember, I talked about how I gave you the story about my father being a vacuum cleaner salesperson way back in the day, and how the more dirt he was able to show the potential customer, the more willing that person was able to buy, or was wanting to buy the vacuum cleaner unit, because the bigger the problem and the more transparently presented the problem, the more the customer was willing to say, okay, yeah, I need this product. And the same, not to use the metaphor of an article as a product, but you are trying to build an argument, and the more transparently and the graver you can present the problem, the more urgent the problem is, then of course, the more likely the person's going to listen to your solution. So in the context of claiming and warranting, claiming and evidence, I've talked to you before about how your results are kind of what can drive your title, as is the case with that title I just showed you about the burden of writing in English, data from Mexican scientists. Those results kind of are forecasted in the title. That is basically your evidence, and the claim is made there. But in the discussion section, you also kind of reprise this idea of claiming and evidence. So when they talk about, the authors talk about the smell, about the speculation, they use the phrase could be due to, because they are speculating, and that's a claim that they're making. We propose that it could be due to changes in amounts, okay? But they don't just leave it at that. They don't just say it could be due and then hope you believe them. They make that claim, yes, but they also warrant. And that all the other things that follow that is the warranting. We propose that it could be due to changes in the amount and or relative abundance of aliphatic acids. And then the axillary region contains abundant numbers of apocrine glands producing milky secretions. For us, apocrine secretion is odorless but is rapidly converted by axillary macroflora to odorous breakdown products. Of particular interest are blah, 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 blah. And so that's all their warranting of that claim. So they do hedge. They make a claim and they hedge that claim, and then they warrant. This move of making a claim but hedging the claim and then warranting that claim in your discussion of the data is a huge part of, it should be an important part of your discussion. That's the evidence for the claim, or as I said, what's called warranting. And then they end that whole move with, if this is the case, we may expect a correlation between the change in the odor and fat proportion of meat. And there you have another hedge. So some common hedges that you find, and you're going to have an exercise on this, a small exercise on Moodle. Some typical hedges that you have here, where it's like may, can, could, might, possibly, and then you have these verbs that are related to cause and effect, about the observed effects that you're talking about. And so what you have is you can link these things, like blah 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 may have been caused by blah blah blah, or blah 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 can be attributed to, or might be due to, is possibly related to, likely is a result of, and all of those can be connected. Also, you have this kind of would and seem and suggest. So like blah, blah, blah would seem to suggest or appears to suggest, and those also commonly are used as hedges. You're going to have these slides online so you can look at these more slowly. And again, you'll have an exercise on this in Moodle. All right, so now we're concluding this class, but I want to talk about, before we conclude, about the move to conclude. Because a lot of people say, well, do I have to have a conclusion? And how do I signal a conclusion? Well, the most important thing is whether you have a heading or not, whether you have a subheading that says conclusion or not, is not really the most important thing. The most important thing is that you clearly make a move to conclude, and there are moves that you can do to signal that conclusion. Just as you do when you're finishing a conversation, there are certain moves that you make to conclude a call, for example. So in Brazil, I learned that there's a particular phrase that is used, is very common, which is this então tá. If somebody says então tá or então tá bom, to me it's a signal saying, okay, this person wants to end the call. So I know that now as a signal, and so therefore I can use that signal to subtly or not so subtly say, okay, I want to end this call now. Então tá bom. And then some other move after that, wishing the person well, to say hello to their family and so on. And you have all these moves that are culturally diverse. But the point is that I'm familiar with these moves. I use these moves. I know what they are. And there are moves like that that you can use in your article to signal that you're concluding. So should you have a separate section? Should it be integrated into the discussion? How do you signal? And what should you include? And the answer to the last question is basically a lot of the same things that you have in your discussion section. If you have a separate conclusion section, you can put in there as well. The first thing, though, before you decide whether or not you want to have a conclusion or not, is one of the best things you can do is simply look at the journal that you're going to submit to. look to see if all of the journal articles that they publish have a, how do the authors conclude? Do they have a separate section? Is it integrated into the discussion? Sometimes a journal may have a requirement that's a separate conclusion section. Sometimes they have a requirement that it be bullet pointed. Every journal has different requirements. Look at what the journal does before you decide, to help you decide anyway. So let's give you a few examples here. Here you have a clinical research study from the American Journal of Medicine, and they're talking about anticoagulation control, and they have a separate conclusion. And in that journal, they often have a separate conclusion. And look at what the moves they make. They say medical non-adherence is an important public health issue, especially for patients taking OACs. Clinicians are currently ill-equipped to address these challenges with few simple tools to accurately identify patients with poor adherence. The VAS, which is some kind of survey that they have, some kind of tool, is a promising tool to help clinicians assess patient adherence that is quick, inexpensive, and easily implemented. Future studies are needed to validate our findings, and determine whether self-reported medication adherence can predict outcomes for patients taking anticoagulation and improve their safety. So you may have noticed here that there is a move that kind of is a claiming of centrality, which is what you'd find in the very first sentence of the introduction. You have the problem that they're addressing, which is kind of also territory, setting them up for the move to. Then they talk about what they did, which is something that they discussed in the earlier discussion section. And then they point the way forward, future studies. So all of these moves talking about the recap, that's the first sentence, then they talk about the application, and they move and how what the contribution is for future studies. So the familiar moves that you have in the discussion section, you can also put in the conclusion section. Same thing here. This is from an article that we saw at CAPA a couple of years back, that was published in this journal on inflammatory response to glycation and end products. This professor, if she is here, I say hello to you. Thank you for all the great articles that you sent our way. And in that article, they very appropriately have a conclusion section that, again, recaps what they did. So they say, in conclusion, the study demonstrates in vitro that the anti-inflammatory effects of sevelamer on endothelial cells and monocytes may be due not only to its classic effect on phosphate, but also its binding capacity to AGEs and possibly uremic toxins. So even though they have a heading here for conclusion, they actually have the word in conclusion. It recaps what they did, talks about that it's a good therapeutic option, so the application, and then they talk about in the future. In the future, other studies can do. So the same moves that you would see in the discussion section, you see here in the conclusion section. But look also what they do very well is they also hedge. So you have the may be due to, might be considered, perhaps, should, and so on. All of these things could, all of these little hedge words, these hedges, are also there in the conclusion section, again, because they're doing a good job of being careful about the claims they make, even in reference to future research. So they did a good job there. Other research examples, this one from food science, food quality and preference, dynamics of food breakdown during eating in relation to perceptions of texture and preference. This is really just kind of parenthetically, this line of research is fascinating because they talk about how many bites someone takes. They measure everything. It's so different from what I researched, but it's fascinating stuff. And as I mentioned before, here you have this journal here of food quality and preference. They often have in their journal articles a kind of bullet-pointed conclusion. And so if you submitted a journal article that deviated from that, maybe the journal would ask you to rewrite it or whatever, or maybe they would say, hey, this person hasn't read our journal, and they're not formatting it in the way we expect. But the point is also that they have the same moves. So here, the oral breakdown path for biscuits differed between consumers and was related to subjects' chewing efficiencies with almonds and chewing gum. So that there reprises something that they said was the purpose of the research and the results. So they recap the results, and they also kind of expand on what they found, and they extrapolate and they elaborate. But notice that they have all these mays in there, these hedges in the conclusion section as well. So that's it doesn't stop in the discussion section. People ask, can the discussion and conclusion be integrated? Absolutely. Again, look at your journal before you make the decision. Look at the journal you intend to submit to before you decide. Excuse me, but yes, of course, they can be integrated. So in this +1 study that I've showed you a couple times already about limitations, they don't have a separate section, but they signal. In conclusion, our data show that reporting of limitations, so they just simply signal. This is the então tá of this research. And they also signal if you didn't have this, they also signal by the moves they make. If you recall, those 6 discussion elements that I showed you, the recapping or reprising of elements earlier in the article, talking about what you found, and the expanding, extrapolating, elaborating, talking about the applications, talking about the limitations, and talking about future research. Those things generally appear in the order in which authors generally feature them in their articles. And so if you make a move to talk about the future, that in itself, the fact that you talk about future directions is already an implicit signal that you're ending the article. So here, finally, scientific may be slowed down. Reporting limitations more completely would aid an appropriate amount of hedging, given these limitations could provide future scientific inquiry. And so just the fact that they mentioned the word future already signals to the reader that they are making a move to conclude. Just like in a telephone conversation, if I say to somebody, então tá, and then even if I didn't say então tá, if I just said, mande por favor abraço, please send so-and-so a hug, and already, if I'm talking about so-and-so, your family or whatever, your friends, that last thing, that last gesture of social friendliness is something that usually you only talk about at the end of a conversation. It would be kind of weird to say in the middle of a conversation with somebody, oh, before I forget, send a hug. It's not that common. But in the end, after you say então tá, to talk about send a hug to somebody and, let's get together soon, those are all things that clearly signal that you're ending a call. Here, talking about the future research is a clear signal that the person is ending the article. Here you have something from dermatological science, just to kind of show you a panorama of different things. And here you have the phrase in conclusion, which again is the então tá of this article. And then you have at the very end that all of these things they talk about, these genetic things, suggest that these cells, that this pathway may play, this may play an important role in PPPP pathogenesis. It's a kind of nod to future research. So again, the in conclusion is a clear signal, but it's strengthened by the fact that they make a move with this talking about future research and applications. I've mentioned this article before with the Galapagos marine iguanas, and I was wondering who their subjects were. And they signal with this overall kind of is this interesting discourse marker that says, okay, now I'm going to talk about everything overall, the general things to end. It's a nod, it's a signal that you're concluding. But also, again, they talk about the implications, but a nod to future research or future applications. So they say, this good news should be tempered with the potential, and so that's a limitation, that the tourist-exposed iguana's long-term survival may be compromised, since their lowered corticosterone response to a stressful stimulus may limit the beneficial effects of acute corticosterone release. And so they talk about overall, but they talk about that these things are tempered with limitations. And remember, talk about limitations and practical effects and implications are usually come at the end. You would not begin your conclusion section, you wouldn't begin a discussion section with those bits of information. In this article from the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, it's a brief report talking about theory of mind inventory, and they talk about the importance of this inventory, and they say they don't use any discourse marker. There's nothing here, there's nothing that says overall or in conclusion. Instead, they talk about the applications, the implications. This study supports the importance. The theory of mind research inventory. These paradigms require the scheduling of child visits. In a related vein, the study supports the notion that parents are sensitive to relationship of mentalizing ability to social function in their children. In summary, we propose the continued and expanded use of theory of mind inventory in research settings to advance its potential. So they do signal with this, in summary, what they propose, but they also talk about the future, in continued and expanded use to advance potential. And so that in itself is a good way to wind down the conclusion. And this one, which is the Journal of Food Policy, sorry for the noise in the background. Altruism, Reciprocity in Health, a Social Experiment in Restaurant Choice. There's no signal here. There's no overall, there's no in conclusion, there's no in summary, there's nothing here to begin the paragraph. Instead, they talk about what's still needed, the future directions. So while additional research should be conducted to replicate and broaden our findings, our results are nonetheless an exciting starting point for examining how trust and altruism in food choice might be integrated into public health initiatives. So you have a hedge here, but they end in this nod to the future, but also you could say it's kind of an exciting high note that they even use the word exciting. They're saying that this is exciting, and it points to promising avenues into future research. And so that ends the article. That's the conclusion, the last thing they say. Here you have something very different from the European Journal of Operational Research, the Lanchester model for three-way combat. So this is optimality, optimization. And here they again, it's a nod to the future. So there's no in conclusion, there's no in summary, nothing like that. But they do say it's only a first step. So that already is a signal. The presented model is only a first step. They're talking about the future now, because they're saying this is just the beginning. To understand the impact of force allocation in a three-opponent conflict. The next step, so future research, the next step to understand optimal strategies in a combat with three opponents would be to consider allocation, which depends on the size of the state variables. Okay, so all of that, there is again an implicit signal that they're winding down, and that's good. So that's really all I have to say about the conclusion and this and the discussion section. And now what you have is you have basically a good strong overview of all the sections, all the typical sections of the IMRAD research article structure, which again can have different permutations. But you have what should go in introduction section. You have an idea of how to present your results. We've had the discussion about elemental graphicus and all that. That there are 3 levels of presenting your results: the data themselves, inferences, and interpretations. And then you also know about your method section, and what can go wrong there, and how the method section could and should be explicit on the variables that you're looking at and why. And you also have a good notion, I think, now about the ingredients that go into the discussion and or conclusion section. But the important thing is that, as we've already talked about, the IMRAD, there's the introduction, the results, the introduction method, results, and discussion. You should have the why, the question of why you're doing this should be clear throughout. So not only what you're researching, but why. Not only why how you did the research, but why you did it that way. And not only recapping what you found, but why you think the things that you do, why you think those interpretations of your data, of your results, are valid. Also, you also have, I think by now, a notion that throughout the IMRAD, there's a guy out there you should be thinking about, and that's the naysayer. That he wants to know why you're doing that research, why it's important, why the method that you're putting together is supposed to work, and why you think what you do. So that affects the language that you use, as we've seen. And all of those things, again, in the IMRAD are interconnected. That the title connects to the abstract connects to the introduction, which connects to the method section and the results, and then the discussion, and all that back to the other sections. So the things that you mentioned in the discussion relate to elements that you talked about in the introduction, and to the method that you use and why you think those things, that your interpretations are valid based on the method that you constructed, and so on. It's all interconnected. So even though you have watched this course and me present things in a separate way, talk about the introduction that's separate from the method, all those things are connected, and they're connected by all of those strands of claiming and warranting, that they say and that I say. And so what I hope now is that you have a pretty good, at least a better notion about what goes into a research article when you sit down, because many of you are still at the early stages of collecting your data and so on. But at least I hope that now, when you go down when you finally do sit down, if you haven't done so already, when you sit down and write your research article, that you have a better idea of what should go into those sections and why they should go into those sections, and some of the things that you can do to improve your writing of those sections, the IMRAD, or whatever permutation of that you have for your particular science. Now, we move to a different part of the course. We're not talking about the IMRAD more after this. Instead, we're going to go on to something that I see as equally important. And there are two things now that are almost are not usually included in writing courses, but I see them as key to successful publication. And these have also been called occluded genres, writing genres that aren't talked about enough because they're not hidden, they're not published out there. Which is, first of all, next week we have Shirley Coles coming in, and perhaps Regiane Ribeiro. from the sector of communication at the university. And they're going to talk about, okay, beyond the research article, how can you cause an impact of your study and make it known more widely in society and translate your research to the person who's not from your science, and get it out there for people to read and to understand, because too often we talk to our own belly buttons in our sciences, to ourselves and our peers, and that's who we write to in our articles. But obviously, most of us are researching areas that we feel are of broader interest beyond the people who just read those journals that affect society in general. So next week, we're gonna have a speaker talk about how do you do that? How and when do you start producing a release to the media, for example? Talk about your research and ways that you can do that, practical tips. And then the last week, the week after next, we move on to another very important aspect of your submission process, which is that when you write an article and you finish your conclusion section, that doesn't conclude the publication process. It would be great if you could just snap your fingers and send your article off to a journal, and then the journal say, yeah, we love it. What usually happens, of course, is that you send your manuscript, and then there are a few points, observations about the things that the journals want you to change or alter in some way. And so there are ways of dealing with journal editors and journal reviewers that we're going to talk about next week. Also, important things like your cover letter. How do you structure that? What's a good way of putting that together? That's also a very important way of selling your research. And also a few other important elements of the publication process, like how to avoid predatory journals, which are becoming too common, and how to watch out for plagiarism, and why that's important, and what can happen. So all of those things that's the last thing that we talk about in this course. I see those things as equally important in the publication process as the writing itself. But the article itself now has been covered, it's done and dusted, and I hope that you find all of that useful. I'm looking forward to reading what you have to say about your own research, and that's it for now. So good luck to you all. Hope you have a good rest of the week. Stay warm because it's freezing over here, and I wish you all the best.